Hello, my name is Scarlett, and I want to share something special with you today. It's not just about grammar, it's not about being perfect. It's about sounding natural when you speak English, just like native speakers do. When I first started learning, I could read well. I could write fine, but when it came to speaking, I froze. My mouth couldn't match my thoughts. I sounded robotic, slow, and unsure, but things changed, not in one day, not in one week. But step by step, I learned how to speak English naturally, and now I want to show you exactly how I did it through 5 simple tips that changed my speaking forever. Tip 1. I listened more than I spoke. Like a baby learning to talk, when I first realized that my English sounded too robotic, too stiff, I felt discouraged. I had spent so many hours studying grammar, writing sentences, and memorizing vocabulary. Yet whenever I tried to speak, something felt off. It was like I was reading from a script, flat, unnatural, and sometimes even confusing. Native speakers didn't talk like I did. Their English had rhythm, flow, and feeling. Mine had pauses, hesitation, and fear. That's when I started paying attention, not to textbooks this time, but to how English was actually spoken in the real world. I asked myself, how do babies learn to talk? They don't start with grammar rules. They don't correct themselves every time. They just listen deeply, daily, and for months before they ever say a word. So I decided to follow the same path. I became a listener first. I began my mornings with English sounds. I would wake up, brush my teeth, and instead of scrolling social media, I'd play a short podcast or a piece of a YouTube video from a native speaker. Not to study it, not to take notes, just to let the sounds wash over me. At first, I didn't even try to understand every word. I focused on the way they spoke, how they connected words, how their voices went up and down, how they laughed in the middle of talking, how they sometimes used short words like huh, like and HMM. Those small sounds felt so real, so alive, and I realized I had never learned them in class. These weren't in grammar books, these were the real sounds of English. The invisible glue that held conversations together. In the afternoons, I would play my favorite show, Friends. I had watched it before with subtitles, but now I watched it differently. I turned the subtitles off and simply listened. At first, it was hard. I missed a lot. But I didn't give up. I chose one short scene and watched it 5, 10, even 15 times. I wasn't trying to study anymore. I was trying to absorb. I let the emotions in the voices guide me. I could hear when someone was angry, when someone was joking, when someone was shy. Even if I didn't understand every word, I understood the feeling. That was powerful. It made me realize that English wasn't just a language of rules. It was a language of rhythm, feeling, and sound. Slowly, I began to whisper along with the show, repeating little phrases under my breath like, "Could you be any slower?" or "Oh my God." Just like the characters, the more I listened, the more I started noticing patterns. Certain phrases came up again and again, not fancy vocabulary, but natural. Real-life expressions like, "What's going on?" "No way." "Are you serious?" "That makes sense." These were gold. I wrote them down in a little notebook and read them aloud at night. I didn't memorize them word for word. I just let them become part of my ears, part of my memory. I stopped being afraid of not understanding everything. I trusted that my brain would catch on, just like a child's brain does. And it did. Sometimes I would hear someone say something, and I'd realize I knew exactly what they meant, not because I translated it in my head, but because I had heard that phrase so many times. It became part of me. I also started using songs to train my ears. I picked slow, emotional songs where I could hear each word clearly. I didn't worry about the lyrics at first. I would just close my eyes, play the song on repeat, and feel the words. After some days, I would try to sing along, not worrying about being perfect, just enjoying the sound. That helped me more than I expected. My pronunciation started improving without me even trying. I wasn't forcing anything. I was simply letting my brain and mouth get used to the music of English. Over time, I realized I was developing a kind of English brain. I would hear a sentence in a podcast and it would pop into my mind. Later in the day, I wasn't trying to learn, but I was learning. I wasn't trying to speak, but the words were building inside me. It felt natural, it felt easy, and most importantly, it felt real. I had finally found the way in, listening like a baby, listening without pressure, listening with love. Then something interesting happened one afternoon while watching Friends again. That same show I had listened to so many times, I felt a strong desire to repeat what I was hearing. Not just listen, not just observe, but actually speak along with the characters. I paused the scene, rewound it, and said the line with them again, then again. I didn't plan it. I just wanted to speak. It came from inside me like a baby who suddenly wants to try a new word for the first time. And that, right there, is what led me to my next step, because listening wasn't enough anymore. Now, I was ready to shadow real voices, to repeat them in real time. Tip 2. I shadowed native speakers every day. That moment when I paused the TV show and repeated the line out loud was like a spark being lit inside me. After all those weeks of listening quietly, soaking in the voices and rhythms of English like a sponge, my mouth suddenly felt ready to move. It wasn't a decision I had planned, it was something I felt. My tongue, my lips, my breath, they all wanted to join the music I had been hearing for so long. I remember the exact line I spoke along with, "Well, maybe I don't need your money." Wait, did I just say that out loud? It was a funny, sarcastic line from Monica, and as I said it, I found myself laughing. Not because the joke was hilarious, but because I actually sounded like her, just for a second. I sounded like a native speaker. That little second of imitation, that split moment of fluency, was the birth of my next practice, something I later learned was called shadowing. I had never heard of the word shadowing in language learning before, but once I stumbled across a video of a polyglot talking about it, I realized it was exactly what I had just started doing. Shadowing meant listening to a native speaker and repeating what they said in real time, as close to their voice as possible, like their shadow. No pausing, no stopping to translate. Just speak, speak, speak. It was scary at first. My first thought was, how can I do that? I can't keep up. But then I reminded myself how babies learn again. They copy even if they say it wrong at first. They try. And the more they try, the better they get. So I made a promise to myself. For the next 30 days, I would shadow native speakers every single day, even if only for 5 minutes. And I meant it. I picked a short video, a TED Talk by a woman who spoke clearly and confidently. I played the first 30 seconds and tried to repeat her. I failed horribly. My words tripped over hers. I got breathless. I skipped half the sentence. But instead of feeling embarrassed, I laughed. This was new. This was exciting. This was real practice. Each day, I returned to the same clip. I would listen to the speaker's sentence, rewind, and repeat it at the same time. I tried to match her tone, her speed, even the tiny hesitation she made. I started noticing how her voice dropped at the end of a sentence, how she paused naturally between thoughts, how she emphasized certain words with emotion. I wasn't just copying the words, I was copying the entire performance of speaking. At first, I felt silly, like I was acting in a play that wasn't mine, but as the days passed, those lines started to feel like my lines, that voice started to feel like my voice. And slowly, I began to develop something I had never felt before: spoken confidence. One thing I noticed was that shadowing didn't just improve my pronunciation. It also improved my listening. Since I had to speak at the same time as the speaker, I had to really listen. I had to listen not just for meaning, but for details. The way going to became gonna, how want to became wanna, how you know turned into you know. These were the sounds I had missed in my early studies. I began to hear the secret English, the one native speakers use in real life, not the slow, perfect English in classrooms. To make shadowing fun, I started using scenes from my favorite shows, short dialogues, no more than a minute long. I would play Joey and Rachel's conversations, Chandler's sarcastic lines, and Phoebe's silly songs. I'd stand in front of my mirror, earbuds in, and repeat after them like I was one of the cast. I even acted out their facial expressions and hand gestures. It made me laugh, but it also made me improve fast. By pretending to be those characters, I stopped overthinking. I stopped caring about sounding silly. I just spoke, and that's when something magical began to happen. I started to sound natural. There was one moment I'll never forget. I was shadowing a scene from a movie called The Intern. It was a calm, emotional dialogue between two characters, and I tried to match their tone. I spoke with feeling, not just accuracy, and when I finished, I looked at myself in the mirror and thought, that sounded good for the first time in my life. I liked how my English sounded, not because it was perfect, but because it was real. That single minute of shadowing gave me a feeling of pride that no grammar test ever could. I also discovered that shadowing didn't have to take hours. Sometimes I only had 10 minutes before class or before going to bed, but I still did it. I made it a part of my routine, just like brushing my teeth. Even on days when I felt tired or unmotivated, I still shadowed one small clip. Consistency was the key, and because it was fun, it didn't feel like a chore. It became a little game I played with myself. Can I sound just a little bit more native today than I did yesterday? As the weeks passed, I noticed something shocking in real conversations. My mouth started saying things without thinking. Words and phrases I had shadowed before just came out naturally. Someone would ask me, "Do you want to hang out later?" And I'd reply, "Sure, sounds good," without translating in my head. Those were phrases I had shadowed hundreds of times. They lived in my muscle memory now. I didn't have to remember them. They were already part of me. Eventually, I started recording myself while shadowing. That was tough. Hearing your own voice is never easy. But when I compared my first recording to my most recent one, I couldn't believe the difference. My earlier version sounded flat, slow, unsure. My newer version, confident, expressive, and natural. I still had an accent, yes, and I was okay with that, but I had rhythm. I had emotion. I had presence. That's what made the difference. And something even more surprising happened. Shadowing made me feel connected to English. I didn't feel like it was a foreign language anymore. I felt like it was mine. The voices I copied had become my guides, my invisible teachers. They showed me not just how to talk, but how to express, how to react, how to pause and breathe, and laugh in English. I stopped seeing English as something to fight with. I started seeing it as something I could dance with. Still, shadowing alone wasn't enough. I had practiced in front of mirrors. I had copied my favorite actors, but now I needed to take this new, growing confidence and use it in real life. The way children eventually step out and try their new words on others. I too had to leave the safety of my room. I remember thinking, okay, Scarlett, you've listened like a baby, you've shadowed like an actor, but now it's time to talk like a real person out there in real life with real people. That decision led me into the next part of my journey, and it was the most terrifying, but also the most rewarding. Tip 3, I thought in English. Even about simple things. After spending weeks shadowing native speakers, mimicking their expressions, absorbing their rhythm, matching their voices like a mirror, I began to feel something shift inside me. I wasn't just sounding more natural when I repeated their words. I was starting to feel more natural too. My tongue didn't freeze up the way it used to. My voice didn't sound like a broken robot reading from a teleprompter. The phrases I had heard 100 times, "Are you kidding me? I mean, seriously, that's awesome," were now rolling out of my mouth with surprising ease. But even then, a part of me knew I was still practicing in a controlled environment. I was performing, acting, rehearsing. I wasn't living in English yet. It became clear to me that while shadowing was powerful, it wasn't the final step. It was a rehearsal. like a musician practicing scales or an actor learning lines. But I wanted more than rehearsal, I wanted reality. I didn't just want to speak English in front of a mirror or with fictional TV characters. I wanted to think in English from the moment I opened my eyes in the morning to the moment I drifted off to sleep at night. I wanted English to be not just a skill I turned on during practice time, but a part of who I was. That realization came slowly but clearly one day while I was sitting alone at a cafe, sipping my usual coffee, watching people walk by through the big glass window. I used to sit in that same spot and think in my native language, observing life around me, making mental notes like she looks upset, or that couple is having a sweet moment, but this time without even planning. My mind said, she looks kind of sad, and then a second later, maybe they're having a fight. But they still love each other. It hit me right then, those thoughts had come to me in English, and I didn't even try. That one moment, as small as it may seem, was huge for me. It was like discovering that a seed I had planted long ago had started to sprout, silently, steadily, without me even noticing. From that day, I decided to water that seed intentionally. I wanted to think in English on purpose, not just when I was in practice mode, but during the ordinary, boring, quiet parts of my day. And so I began the most intimate part of my English-speaking journey, turning English into the language of my thoughts. At first, it felt awkward. I would brush my teeth in the morning and try to narrate what I was doing in English. I'm brushing the top teeth now. This toothpaste is too minty. I should get a new one. It felt strange, almost like I was forcing another voice into my brain, but I stuck with it. I knew that the only way to sound natural in English was to think naturally in English. If my thoughts were still in my native language, then every English sentence I spoke would be a translation, slow, stiff, and lifeless. I began small. I gave myself tiny challenges each day. One day, I told myself, think in English while making breakfast. So I did. I looked at the eggs and thought, these look fresh. Then, I need to be careful not to burn them. I opened the fridge and thought, out of milk again. It wasn't fancy, it wasn't deep, but it was English, and it was mine. Another day, I set the goal to think in English while walking to class. Why is it so hot today? That guy's haircut is interesting. I wonder if we'll have a quiz today. I kept it casual, like a conversation with myself, no pressure to be correct or perfect. And that's what made it work. As this habit grew, I started thinking in English in more emotional moments too. When I felt nervous before giving a presentation, I told myself, you've got this, just breathe. When I felt happy after someone complimented my English, I smiled and thought, that made my day. I even began dreaming in English sometimes, just short, blurry conversations, but still a sign that my mind was adjusting. The line between my native language and English was slowly becoming thinner. I wasn't replacing one with the other. I was simply making space in my brain for both to exist together. One of the most powerful benefits of thinking in English was that I started to build automatic fluency. I didn't have to stop and translate every sentence before speaking. I didn't have to rehearse every word in my head, because I had already practiced forming thoughts in English during quiet, ordinary moments. Speaking them out loud became faster, easier, and more natural. My conversations flowed better. I didn't panic as much when someone spoke to me suddenly. My replies came out quicker, more confidently, and without that long pause where I used to fumble for words. This internal practice also changed how I saw the world. Thinking in English made me more aware of words and phrases I heard around me. I started noticing signs, slogans, and snippets of conversation. I became curious about how native speakers express themselves, even in casual chats. And because my mind was already thinking in English, I could catch those expressions and store them right away. It was like my brain was always recording, always learning, even when I wasn't trying to. I also started journaling in English. Just a few sentences each night, nothing fancy. Today was exhausting. I had too much on my plate. Or, I finally spoke up in class and I'm proud of myself. It was private, personal, and real. The more I wrote, the more I found that I had things to say. English wasn't just for school or TV anymore. It was becoming the language of my inner life, my thoughts, my feelings, my reflections. They all began to exist in English. Of course, it wasn't always smooth. There were days when I struggled to find the right words in my mind. Times when my thoughts got stuck or felt too complex to express in English. But instead of switching back to my native language, I simplified. If I couldn't think of anxious, I'd say worried. If frustrated didn't come easily, I'd say, I don't like this. I learned to use simple words to express complex feelings. That was a lesson in itself. That natural speaking doesn't require big words, it requires clear words, and with that, my confidence grew quietly but powerfully. I wasn't practicing in front of anyone. I wasn't performing or pretending. I was simply living in English, moment by moment, thought by thought. It felt honest. It felt personal. It felt mine, even if I didn't speak a word out loud all day. I knew I was still practicing every time I noticed something and thought about it in English. Eventually, this new habit of internal English led me to an even braver step. Because after all the listening, shadowing, and thinking, there came a time when I had to go out into the world and use this natural English in real conversations, with real people, in real situations, where I couldn't plan or rehearse, where I had to respond, react, and express on the spot. And that, as you can imagine, was both terrifying and thrilling. But it was also the next natural step in my journey, because once you start thinking in English, you realize it's time to start living in it out loud. Tip 4. I used English in real life. Even when I was nervous after weeks of thinking in English, in the kitchen, on the bus, while getting dressed, while brushing my hair, I had begun to feel that English wasn't just something I was practicing anymore. It was becoming something I lived with, a quiet, invisible friend that followed me through my day. I thought in English while ordering groceries online, when checking the weather, or when imagining how I'd explain something to a friend. I had grown comfortable inside the English world in my mind, where no one judged me, no one corrected me, and I could move as freely as I wanted. But in the back of my mind, I knew this wasn't the finish line, because language, no matter how well you know it privately, isn't truly alive until you share it with someone else. Real growth, I realized, would only come when I used English in real-life conversations. And just the thought of that sent a wave of nervous energy through my chest. I still remember the first time I pushed myself out of my comfort zone. I was sitting in a coffee shop one afternoon. The same cafe where I had first noticed my thoughts starting to appear in English. A group of tourists came in, Americans. I could tell from their accents. They were looking at the menu, confused, and one of them asked aloud, "Do they even serve almond milk here?" The barista seemed unsure how to respond. I could have stayed quiet. I could have smiled politely and gone back to sipping my tea, but something inside me, something bold and impatient, whispered, "Scarlett, say something." And before I could back out, I turned to them and said, "Yeah, they have almond milk. You just have to ask. It's not on the menu." My voice was soft, nervous. My heart pounded in my chest. But I said it, and they smiled, grateful. One of them replied, "Oh, thank you so much." I nodded and looked away quickly, like a shy kid, but inside, I was exploding with pride. That was the first time I had used my English for real, out in the wild, and it hadn't killed me. From that moment on, I made a rule. Every week, I had to speak English to at least one real person. It didn't matter if it was just a sentence, a question, a greeting. It had to happen. Because I knew that real conversations were messy, unpredictable, and raw, exactly what I needed to get better. My internal English world had become strong. But now it needed to face the real one. At first, I started with low-risk situations, ordering food, asking for directions, answering basic questions at a bookstore. I remember the first time I walked into an English learning meetup in my city. My palms were sweaty. My stomach twisted with anxiety. There were a dozen people sitting in a circle, chatting casually. Some were fluent, some not. I sat down, heart pounding, and introduced myself. Hi, I'm Scarlett. I've been learning English for a while, but this is my first time speaking it in public. My voice shook, but no one laughed. No one judged. In fact, they welcomed me with smiles and warm encouragement. That night, I spoke more English than I had in my entire life. I made mistakes, of course I did. I forgot words, mixed up tenses, paused awkwardly, but I survived, and more importantly, I grew. After that, I started searching for more speaking opportunities. I joined online language exchange platforms. I matched with native speakers who were learning my native language, and we would take turns, 15 minutes in my language, then 15 minutes in English. I'll be honest, the first few calls were terrifying. I'd rehearse what I wanted to say ahead of time. I'd write notes. I'd worry endlessly about sounding stupid. But every conversation taught me something new, not just about language, but about people. I learned how to be patient, how to listen actively, how to express ideas even when I didn't know the perfect word. One day, while chatting with a woman from Texas, she said, "Scarlett, I really enjoy talking with you. You sound so natural." I almost cried. That one sentence felt like a gold medal. But using English in real life isn't always perfect. There were moments that shook me, like the time I joined a Zoom speaking club and I blanked out completely. It was my turn to answer a question about my hobbies and my mind just stopped. I sat there, frozen, while everyone waited. I finally managed to say, "I like books and walking." I felt humiliated. After the call ended, I sat on my bed and cried. I told myself I wasn't good enough, that I should stick to thinking and listening. But deep down, I knew that failure was part of the process. I reminded myself of how children learn to speak through stumbles, silly moments, and plenty of practice. And the next day, I joined another speaking session. I didn't let fear win. The beauty of real-life conversations is that they train your brain in ways no book ever can. They teach you to respond, to adapt, to listen actively, and speak with feeling. I began to notice that my speech became more automatic. I no longer needed to translate my thoughts, they just came. I used small talk phrases I'd heard in movies. "No worries, that's hilarious. Tell me about it." I used fillers and expressions naturally. My grammar wasn't always perfect, but my message was clear, and that's what communication is really about. Over time, I became braver. I started volunteering to help English-speaking tourists at cultural events. I spoke to international students at my university. I even offered to lead a beginner conversation group for shy learners like I once was. Each of these moments built a stronger version of me, one that wasn't afraid of making mistakes, of not knowing every word, of being seen as a learner. I had learned to carry my English with pride, not shame. One of the most powerful things I learned from speaking in real life is that nobody cares as much as you think they do. Most people are patient. They don't judge your accent. They appreciate your effort. In fact, many native speakers are impressed that you're trying. I remember once, after a conversation with a Canadian traveler at a bookstore, he told me, "Your English is great. I wish I could speak your language like that." That moment made me realize that I had always looked at myself as behind, when in reality, I had come so far. Another surprising benefit was how speaking in real life improved my listening. When you're talking to real people, you start to notice how they really speak, the speed, the tone, the emotion. You pick up new words and expressions naturally. I started writing down cool phrases I heard in conversations, like "that's a tough call," or "it slipped my mind," and I used them in future chats. Slowly, those phrases became mine. My English was growing, not just in skill, but In personality. Yes, I still got nervous before every new conversation that never fully went away. But I learned to carry that nervousness with me like a backpack that I didn't have to drop, but could walk with anyway. Nervousness didn't mean I was weak, it meant I cared, it meant I was challenging myself. And each time I pushed through it, I added a new layer of confidence eventually. Speaking English became part of my identity, not something I turned on. For 30 minutes and then off, it became something I lived. I joked in English. I shared memories in English. I even argued politely in English once, and I was proud of how well I explained my feelings. My English had evolved from something I studied into something I used, owned, and loved. Looking back, I see now that all those nervous, awkward moments, those shaky sentences, those silent pauses, those times I blushed and wanted to disappear, they were the building blocks of my fluency. Each one mattered, each one pushed me forward, because you can study English all you want. But until you use it in real life, you'll always be a step away from fluency. And now that I had taken that step, now that I had lived English in the real world, I was ready to take it even further because there was one final lesson I had to learn. Tip 5. I stopped being perfect. I focused on being real after everything I'd been through, the listening, the shadowing, the quiet thinking, and the brave real-life conversations. I started to notice something unexpected. My English had improved, yes, but there was still a voice in my head that sometimes whispered, "It's not good enough," even when people smiled and said, "Your English is great." Even when I could hold entire conversations, make jokes, and express my feelings, that small, nagging voice still found a way to show up. It would whisper things like, "You made a grammar mistake just now," or "Your pronunciation wasn't perfect," or "Did you really just say that awkward phrase?" And slowly, I realized that the final thing holding me back wasn't vocabulary, it wasn't grammar, it wasn't even my accent, it was the pressure to be perfect. And that pressure was exhausting. You see, I had spent so long trying to sound like a native speaker, trying to copy their voice, mimic their tone, memorize their phrases, that I forgot something very important. I was me. I wasn't born in an English-speaking country. I wasn't raised in the language. I wasn't supposed to sound exactly like a native speaker, and that was okay. More than okay, it was human. But still, every time I paused too long in a conversation, or someone didn't understand me right away, or I forgot the word I wanted to say, I felt a wave of shame. I would smile on the outside, but inside I'd feel like a failure, like maybe I wasn't ready yet, like maybe I'd never be ready. But one day, something changed. I was at a small language exchange picnic in the park, one of those casual, friendly events where people from different countries come together to practice English. We were all sitting on a big blanket, sharing snacks, talking about travel, and telling stories. A guy named Carlos from Brazil was talking about his first time riding a bicycle. And everyone was laughing. His grammar wasn't perfect, his accent was strong. He even mixed up a few words, but no one cared. In fact, they loved him. He was expressive, alive, and so real. And when he finished his story, people clapped. Not because it was perfect, but because it was honest. That moment hit me like a thunderbolt. I remember thinking, wait, they didn't care about his mistakes. They loved his energy. And I thought back to all the times I had been too scared to speak up, too afraid of messing up a sentence, too focused on sounding perfect instead of just being Scarlett. How many conversations had I missed? How many connections had I avoided? Because I was trying to get everything right. That day, something clicked inside me. I made a new decision. I would stop trying to be perfect in English. I would start focusing on being real. From that point forward, I changed my entire approach to speaking. Instead of rehearsing what I wanted to say ahead of time, I started letting myself speak freely, mistakes and all. If I forgot a word, I'd describe it instead. If I used the wrong tense, I'd just keep going. If I mispronounced something, I'd laugh and say, "Oops, you know what I mean." And guess what? people understood me. People didn't correct me harshly. They didn't walk away. They leaned in, they listened, they saw me. One night, I joined a live online discussion group. The topic was dreams and goals. I was nervous. Who wouldn't be? But instead of preparing a perfect paragraph, I just spoke from the heart. I told them about my journey, my struggles with English, how I used to be terrified of making mistakes. I told them about the time I froze in a Zoom call and cried afterward, and how I learned that fluency isn't about flawlessness, it's about flow. The moderator smiled and said, "Thank you for being so open, Scarlett. That's what real communication is about." Others agreed. And I realized my honesty was my strength. So I kept practicing that. Being honest, being real. I stopped correcting myself in the middle of a sentence unless I really had to. I stopped apologizing for every small mistake. I stopped measuring my worth in English by how native I sounded. I started sharing my stories, my thoughts, my opinions, just like any other speaker would, and the more I did this, the more confident I became. Not because I knew more grammar rules, but because I had finally let go of the need to impress. I also began to understand that speaking naturally doesn't mean speaking perfectly. It means speaking like you, with your emotions, with your humor, with your unique perspective. Native speakers make mistakes too. They forget words. They say and like and all the time. I started noticing that they didn't always speak in full, clean sentences, and yet they communicated beautifully. Why? Because they were comfortable. That's what I wanted to. Not perfection, but comfort in my own skin, and slowly I got there. I remember a turning point when I was walking with a friend who was also learning English. She was telling me about her frustration, how she never felt good enough, how she kept comparing herself to native speakers. I told her everything I had learned. I said, "Stop trying to be perfect. Just talk, just be you. That's enough." She looked at me and smiled. "You sound so natural when you say that," she said, and in that moment, I knew I had become the person I used to look up to, not someone who spoke without mistakes, but someone who spoke without fear. That's when I realized that speaking English naturally isn't about the mouth, it's about the mind. It's about accepting that mistakes are part of learning, that speaking is not a test, that communication is about connection, not correction. And once I embraced that, everything changed. My conversations flowed, my confidence grew. I enjoyed speaking English. I even started to love my slight accent because it was a part of my story, not a flaw to erase. In fact, I began using my story to help others. I started a little blog where I shared my journey, not as a teacher, but as a fellow learner. I wrote about the day I cried after a failed conversation, and the day I laughed at my own mistake and kept going. I wrote about the shift from fear to freedom, and people connected with it. Because we all want the same thing, not just to speak perfectly, but to feel seen, heard, and understood. That, to me, is the heart of speaking English naturally. And now, when I look back at the girl I used to be, the one who stayed quiet in group discussions, who rehearsed every sentence in her head, who wanted to sound like someone else, I don't feel shame, I feel compassion. She was trying. She was brave. And she was building the foundation for who I am today. I don't speak English perfectly, but I speak it honestly, confidently, naturally. And that's what matters most.